My family disowned me the day I married a black woman. For 11 long years, I did not receive a single phone call, not a text message, not even a holiday card. They treated me like a ghost. But last week, the medical technology company my wife and I built finally went public, netting me over $14 million overnight. Suddenly, my 92-year-old mother, the woman who once swore she would rather die than accept my wife, showed up on my front porch with my younger brother and a list of demands. They expected me to save them from financial ruin. They thought I was just an old sentimental fool they could easily manipulate. But the response I gave them did not just shatter their plans. It legally erased their entire existence. It was a Tuesday morning, quiet and perfectly normal. I was standing in our modern kitchen pouring a fresh cup of dark roast coffee for my wife Naomi. At 70 years old, you start to deeply appreciate the simple, peaceful routines. The rich smell of the coffee beans, the sound of the morning news playing softly on the television in the living room, the warm sunlight spilling across the granite countertops. Naomi, a brilliant medical researcher and the co-founder of our company, was sitting at the island counter quietly reviewing some clinical trial data on her tablet. We had just survived the grueling months-long process of an initial public offering, and for the first time in a very long time, we were finally breathing easy. Then the doorbell rang. I did not think much of it. I figured it was a courier dropping off routine legal documents from our attorney. I wiped my hands on a towel, kissed the top of Naomi's head, and walked slowly down the hallway to the front foyer. I turned the deadbolt and pulled the heavy oak door open. What I saw on the other side made my blood turn to absolute ice. Standing on my porch was Victoria, my 92-year-old mother. She was leaning heavily on a polished silver cane, wearing a pristine, tailored wool coat that looked entirely too warm for the mild weather. Standing right behind her was Edward, my 65-year-old brother, wearing his signature expensive suit and a forced, incredibly nervous smile. Seeing them standing there on my property the past 11 years vanished in an instant, pulling me violently back to a cold winter night at the ancestral Caldwell estate. I could still hear the grand-grandfather clock ticking in the background of that massive, lifeless house. I had brought Naomi home to meet my family and formally announce our engagement. Victoria had stood up from the head of the long dining table, her face pale with aristocratic rage. She had pointed a shaking finger at the heavy oak front door and delivered an ultimatum that would forever alter the course of my life. She told me that our bloodline had expectations. She said, "Walk out that door with that black woman, and you are no longer my son. You will receive nothing, you will inherit nothing, and you will be dead to this family." Edward had stood right next to her, arms crossed, silently nodding in agreement. He did not say a word to defend me. He just watched his only brother get thrown away like garbage. I did not yell. I did not argue. I simply took Naomi by the hand, turned my back on the woman who gave birth to me, and walked out into the freezing rain. I never looked back. Not once. Now, over a decade later, the ghosts of my past were standing on my welcome mat. Victoria looked much older, her face lined with deep wrinkles, her hands trembling slightly against the handle of her cane. But her eyes, those sharp, calculating, judgmental eyes, remained exactly the same. Edward shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable under my intense, silent stare. Neither of them said a word at first. They just waited, probably expecting me to gasp in shock, to invite them inside, to fall into their arms in some emotional, tearful family reunion. But I am not a sentimental man. I am a chief engineer and a chief executive officer. I spent 40 years of my life analyzing complex systems, identifying hidden structural flaws, and dismantling things that do not work. And the family standing in front of me was a deeply broken, toxic system. I did not step aside. I kept my hand firmly on the door handle, physically blocking the entrance to my home. "Can I help you?" I asked. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any warmth, surprise, or anger. I sounded exactly like I was addressing a random door-to-door salesman. Victoria's lower lip quivered. She looked up at me, her eyes welling with sudden, highly dramatic tears. "Richard," she whispered, her voice cracking perfectly on the second syllable. "My boy, it has been so long." Edward stepped forward, removing his expensive glasses and wiping his brow as if he were carrying the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. "Hello, Richard," he said, trying to sound weary and deeply humbled. "I know this is unexpected, but please, we need to talk to you. It is about Mother's failing health and the estate. We need your help." I looked closely at Edward. I noted the faint beads of sweat forming on his forehead, despite the cool morning breeze. I noted the way his eyes darted past my shoulder, trying desperately to peer into the expensive interior of my home. The timing of this unexpected visit was flawless. Our company had gone public exactly 6 days ago. The financial news networks had covered the initial public offering extensively. My newfound net worth had been broadcast for anyone who cared to look. For 11 years, my mother's health and the status of the family estate were none of my business. But the exact moment $14 million attached itself to my name, I was suddenly her beloved missed boy again. The sheer audacity of their performance was almost impressive. Before I could tell them to get off my property, I heard soft footsteps approaching from behind me. Naomi walked up and gently placed her hand on my lower back. I felt her tense slightly as she recognized the two people standing on our porch. She remembered them perfectly. She remembered the terrible insults, the cold stares, the blatant discrimination that had driven us away all those years ago. But my wife is a woman of profound grace and superior intelligence. She did not sneer. She did not shout. She did not slam the door in their faces. She simply looked at them with the calm, clinical detachment of a medical doctor examining a highly contagious disease. "Victoria?" Edward, Naomi said quietly, her voice perfectly steady. "What a surprise." Victoria stiffened noticeably at the sound of Naomi's voice. I saw it clearly. It was microscopic, a fleeting tightening of the jaw, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a brief recoil. The ingrained prejudice was still entirely there, hardwired into her bones. But Victoria quickly masked it, forcing a wavering, sorrowful smile. "Naomi, my mother," said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You look lovely. Please, I know we have absolutely no right to be here, but I am a woman, and my heart is failing. I do not have much time left in this world. I just want to fix what I broke before I die. I cannot meet my Maker without making peace with my firstborn son." I looked at Naomi. We communicated 1,000 words in a single shared glance. We knew this was a carefully rehearsed performance. We knew they wanted something substantial. But a brilliant engineer knows that to expose a hidden structural flaw, you have to let the machine run and observe exactly where it breaks down. If I slammed the door right now, they would simply scurry back into the shadows and find another way to bother us. I wanted to see the full extent of their agenda. I wanted them to walk inside and lay all their cards on the table, completely unaware that I was already reading their hands. I slowly stepped back and pulled the heavy oak door completely open, gesturing toward the living room. "Come in," I said, my tone remaining completely neutral. "Let us hear what you have to say." Edward exhaled a loud, exaggerated sigh of relief, while Victoria leaned heavily on her cane, hobbling past me into the foyer. They walked into my home fully believing they had already won the first major battle. They believed my silence was a sign of emotional weakness, a sign that the old, toxic family dynamics could easily be restored. They had absolutely no idea that by crossing my threshold, they were walking directly into a meticulously designed trap that would completely and permanently dismantle their lives. They stepped over the threshold, moving from the cool morning air into the warmth of my foyer. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them with a solid final sound. Victoria paused for a moment to take in the sheer scale of the entryway. Her eyes quickly scanned the imported marble flooring, the vaulted ceiling, and the modern art pieces hanging on the pristine walls. I could see the rapid calculations happening behind her cloudy eyes. She was a woman who measured a person solely by their visible wealth, and the wealth she was standing inside clearly exceeded her highest expectations. But she was also a master of emotional manipulation. Before the silence could stretch into something undeniably awkward, her shoulders slumped and she let out a trembling, fragile breath. The transformation was instantaneous. The sharp, calculating matriarch vanished, replaced flawlessly by a weak, remorseful old woman standing at the end of her life. She leaned heavily on her silver cane, her knuckles turning white, and allowed a single perfect tear to roll down her wrinkled cheek. It was a performance worthy of a grand stage refined over decades of controlling our family narrative. "Richard," she whispered, letting her voice break with practiced vulnerability. "I know you have every right to turn me away," she continued, pulling a pristine white handkerchief from the pocket of her tailored coat. "I have been a terrible mother to you. I let my pride and my foolish traditions blind me to what truly mattered. But my heart is failing, Richard. The doctors say I do not have much time left. Every single night I lie awake in that big, empty house, and the only thing I can think about is the son I drove away. I cannot meet my Maker with this heavy burden on my soul. I cannot leave this world without making peace with my firstborn son." She took a small, shaky step forward, raising a trembling hand as if she wanted to touch my face but did not dare to cross the physical boundary I had established. I watched the tears flow down her face and I felt absolutely nothing. 40 years in the corporate world teaches you how to separate genuine human emotion from calculated business tactics. I knew exactly what a desperate dying person looked like, and Victoria was not it. Her breathing was entirely too controlled. Her posture, despite the heavy reliance on the cane, was firmly rooted and balanced. The tears were real, but they were summoned on demand, a biological parlor trick she had used to bend my father to her will countless times. I remained completely silent, letting her theatrical display hang in the quiet air. When it became absolutely clear that I was not going to step forward and embrace her, Edward decided it was time to play his designated part. He let out a long, heavy sigh, the kind of sigh a weary peacemaker uses to bridge a difficult emotional gap. He reached up and slowly removed his expensive tortoiseshell glasses, rubbing his eyes with his thumb and forefinger, as if he had not slept in weeks. "Richard, please," he said in a low, somber tone, "do not make this harder than it already is. We know we were terribly wrong. We know what happened 11 years ago was entirely unforgivable. But the world has changed so much recently. The global pandemic changed our entire perspective on life. It made us realize how incredibly fragile everything is. All those old prejudices, all that stupid family pride, it means absolutely nothing when you are faced with losing the people who share your blood. Family is everything, Richard. We were wrong. We came to apologize to you. And we came to deeply apologize to Naomi." He looked directly at my wife when he said her name, infusing his voice with a sickeningly sweet tone of manufactured regret. It was a brilliantly constructed dual attack. Victoria played the dying, repentant mother seeking spiritual absolution, while Edward played the enlightened modern man who had finally seen the error of his ways. Together they formed a suffocating net of emotional obligation, trying to trap me in a tight corner where rejecting them would make me look like a cruel, heartless monster. I glanced silently at Naomi. She was standing perfectly still, her posture immaculate, absorbing every single word of their apology with a completely unreadable expression. 11 years ago, they had looked at her as if she were dirt beneath their expensive shoes. Now they were standing in her beautiful foyer under her secure roof, speaking her name as if she were a cherished and loved sister. Naomi did not buy a single word of it. She is a woman of hard science, a dedicated researcher who deals exclusively in hard facts and verifiable evidence, and the sudden, miraculous redemption of Victoria and Edward lacked any logical foundation whatsoever. But Naomi also deeply understood the strategic value of extreme patience. She gave me a very subtle nod, a silent confirmation that we were going to play this game exactly their way, at least for now. "Please," Naomi said, her voice perfectly smooth and utterly devoid of any lingering hostility. There is absolutely no need to remain standing out here in the cold hallway. Come into the living room and sit down. I can bring you some fresh coffee or warm tea." Victoria looked at Naomi with an expression of profound, heavily exaggerated gratitude. "Oh, bless you, my sweet dear," she murmured, taking another shaky, dramatic step forward. "You have always been so incredibly gracious. Even after everything I have done, you still show me such pure kindness." Edward offered a solemn, respectful nod of agreement, placing his right hand gently on his mother's back to guide her slowly forward. They walked past us, moving slowly into the expansive, sunlit living room. I followed closely behind them, watching their greedy eyes dart frantically around the open space, cataloging the high-end contemporary furniture, the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the private garden, and the general atmosphere of quiet, undeniable prosperity. They were walking directly through a literal goldmine, and their carefully manufactured apologies were nothing more than the sharp pickaxes they fully intended to use to dig straight into it. Victoria settled slowly into the plush fabric of our modern sofa, letting out another long, deliberate sigh, as if sitting down required monumental effort. Edward took a seat in the armchair across from her, crossing his legs and resting his hands on his knees in a posture of quiet attentiveness. I remained standing near the archway, leaning casually against the wooden frame. I wanted to maintain a physical elevation over them, a silent reminder that this was my personal territory and domain. The conditioned air in the room grew thick, suffocating beneath heavy layers of forced nostalgia and unspoken financial motives. Naomi returned quietly from the kitchen, carrying a sleek silver tray with 2 cups of hot tea, placing them gently on the glass coffee table before taking a seat to my right. Victoria wrapped her pale, trembling hands firmly around her warm porcelain cup, looking down at the dark, steaming liquid, as if gathering the required emotional strength for her next grand performance. Edward looked up at me again, offering another weak, deeply apologetic smile. We waited in absolute, unbroken silence. I knew they were desperate to get to the true purpose of their unexpected visit. The silence stretched on thick and uncomfortable until Naomi finally broke it. She suggested that since they had traveled all this way, they should stay for an early dinner. It was a tactical move. People can only maintain a false persona for so long before the mask slips. Victoria accepted with eager gratitude. I watched them settle into the dining room chairs they would have scoffed at a decade ago. Naomi prepared a simple but elegant meal of roasted salmon and root vegetables. The initial conversation was painfully superficial. Victoria complimented our home while Edward asked hollow questions about the local weather and traffic. They were circling their true intentions, waiting for an opening. I chewed my food slowly, offering only brief, non-committal answers. I wanted them to work for it. I wanted them to feel the weight of their manufactured suspense. The dining room was bathed in golden light, casting shadows across the table. Every clink of silverware sounded unnaturally loud. Edward kept adjusting his collar, his discomfort radiating through the room. He was a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms. Begging the brother he had discarded was clearly destroying his ego, but his greed was far stronger than his pride. Halfway through the main course, Victoria set her silver fork down. The sharp clink of the metal echoed loudly in the quiet room. She looked down at her hands, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "Richard," she began, her voice trembling with an expertly crafted blend of shame and sorrow. "We did not just come here to apologize for the past. We came because we are facing a terrible crisis, a crisis that threatens our family history." I set my glass of water down and looked at her, my face completely expressionless. "What kind of crisis?" I asked calmly. Victoria squeezed her eyes shut, letting another pair of perfectly timed tears escape. "It is the estate," she whispered softly. "The ancestral home. The place where you grew up, where your father and your grandfather lived their entire lives. It is slipping away from us, Richard. The bank is moving to foreclose on the property. We are going to lose everything." She reached for her water glass, her hand shaking violently. The grand staircase where you took your first steps, the library where your father taught you to read it, will all be gone. Sold off to strangers who care nothing for our bloodline or our history. I shifted my gaze to Edward. He was staring intensely at his half-empty wineglass, playing the part of the disgraced, financially ruined son with absolute perfection. He cleared his throat loudly and sat up straighter, adopting the tone of a serious businessman delivering a tragic quarterly report. "It is entirely my fault, Richard," he said, his voice heavy with manufactured guilt. "You know, I have managed the family trust and my own investment fund for the last 20 years. I always made conservative, calculated decisions. But the global pandemic created a massive, completely unforeseen disruption in the commercial real estate market. We took a devastating hit. Several of our largest anchor investments went completely underwater almost overnight. I tried to salvage the situation by restructuring our debt and liquidating minor assets, but the market downturn was just too severe. The loans were called in abruptly, and the estate, which was legally tied into the trust portfolio, was used as collateral to secure the final lines of credit." He paused, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin, looking at me with wide, pleading eyes. "The bank has given us a final non-negotiable deadline. If we do not satisfy the outstanding balance within 14 days, they will seize the property and auction it off to the highest bidder." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands together and resting them on the table. The performance was meticulously structured. It had all the necessary elements of a compelling tragedy. Unforeseen global circumstances, desperate attempts to save the family honor, and a ticking clock to create an overwhelming sense of urgency. How much, I asked, cutting directly through the emotional noise and the carefully crafted financial jargon. Edward swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling visibly beneath his expensive tailored suit. $4 million, he stated quietly, letting the massive number hang in the heavy air of the dining room. "We need exactly $4 million to clear the debt entirely, satisfy the demanding creditors, and secure the deed permanently. $4 million. It was a very specific, carefully chosen number. It represented slightly less than a third of the $14 million my company had just generated through our initial public offering. It was an amount they calculated I could part with without completely destroying my newly acquired wealth. It was low enough to seem reasonable for a wealthy man to spend on his family, but high enough to secure their financial freedom." Victoria reached across the wide dining table, her pale, trembling hand stopping just inches away from my own. "Richard, I know I have absolutely no right to ask you for anything," she pleaded, her voice rising in a desperate, urgent crescendo that echoed against the high ceilings. "I know I banished you from that house in a moment of terrible, unforgivable blindness. But you are the eldest son. You carry the family name. You are the only one who possesses the resources to save our legacy from total annihilation. If you do this, if you find it in your heart to help us rescue the estate, I will immediately have the lawyers draft a new legally binding deed. I will transfer exactly 50% of the property directly into your name. You will be a rightful, legally recognized half-owner of the Caldwell estate once again." She looked at Naomi, offering another one of those sickeningly sweet, entirely false smiles. "It would not just be a financial transaction, Richard. It would be a profound reunification of our family. A true mutual healing process for all of us. You and Naomi would have your rightful place back in the family hierarchy, and we would finally be whole again after so many years of unnecessary, agonizing division. Please, my son, do not let our legacy end in such a shameful public disgrace. Let us mend this broken bridge." I sat perfectly still, observing the sheer magnitude of their deception. They were attempting to sell me half of a house that they had violently thrown me out of, using my own hard-earned money to bail them out of a disaster they had created. They were wrapping a massive financial bailout in the warm, comforting language of family healing and spiritual redemption. They thought the promise of a deed and a fake apology would blind me to the reality of their sudden, highly convenient arrival. They thought I was desperate for their validation. They were entirely wrong. I looked at Naomi again. She gently placed her fork down her face, a mask of polite consideration, though I knew her brilliant mind was already dissecting every single lie they had just presented. I turned my attention back to the two desperate people sitting across from me. I let the silence stretch for another long, excruciating moment, watching Edward grip the edge of the mahogany table until his knuckles turned a stark, pale white. The air in the room felt incredibly heavy, charged with the dangerous electricity of their unspoken greed. I finally nodded slowly. I picked up my silver fork, turning it slowly in my hands. I looked at Edward, staring at his plate, as if the salmon held the secrets of the universe. Then I looked at Victoria, whose hands were still trembling, though I suspected it was now from genuine anxiety, rather than theatrical sorrow. "Very well," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room with a calm, measured authority. "I will have my financial team look into the numbers. If the documentation aligns with what you have presented today, we can discuss the transfer." The physical reaction to my words was immediate. Edward let out a massive breath, his shoulders dropping 2 inches as the crushing weight of his financial doom seemingly evaporated. He reached for his water glass, his hand shaking so badly that the ice clinked loudly against the sides. Victoria closed her eyes, letting her head fall back against her chair. A genuine, unguarded wave of absolute relief washed over her wrinkled face. She had played her hand, risking the last shred of her dignity, and in her mind she had successfully secured the ultimate prize. The trap had been set. Instantly, the entire dynamic of the room transformed. The sorrowful atmosphere was swept away, replaced by an aggressive wave of manufactured joy. Now that they believed the $4 million was safely within their grasp, Victoria and Edward suddenly became the most loving, attentive family members on the face of the earth. Their primary target for this sudden outpouring of affection was my wife. "Naomi, my dear." Victoria practically cooed, her voice dripping with a sugary sweetness that made my stomach turn. "I cannot get over how beautifully you have decorated this home. The artwork, the light fixtures, it is all so incredibly sophisticated. You always did have such a refined eye. It is a magnificent estate." Edward chimed in right on cue, leaning forward with an enthusiastic, completely artificial grin. "Absolutely, Naomi. And this meal is extraordinary. You must have spent hours preparing it. Richard is an incredibly lucky man to have someone who balances a demanding medical career with such wonderful domestic talents. We are just so thrilled to finally be sitting here with you both, breaking bread like a proper family." Naomi handled the barrage of fake compliments with the effortless grace of a diplomat navigating a hostile territory. She offered polite, quiet smiles, thanking them for their kind words, while gracefully redirecting the conversation away from herself. She did not preen under their sudden approval. She knew just as well as I did that their compliments were nothing more than a cheap currency they were using to purchase my cooperation. They laid it on incredibly thick, desperate to cement the illusion that the ugly racist history between us had been erased by time. It was a masterful performance, and a lesser man might have believed it. But 40 years of building and running a medical technology empire teaches you how to read people on a microscopic level. When you sit in countless boardrooms negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts, you learn that people lie with their words, but they rarely lie with their bodies. The truth always leaks out, usually in a fraction of a second, in the tiny, involuntary muscle movements that the conscious mind cannot control. The meal progressed smoothly until Naomi reached across the table to pass the large porcelain serving bowl of roasted root vegetables. It was a simple, everyday gesture of hospitality. "Here, Victoria," Naomi said softly, holding the edge of the warm bowl out toward my mother. "These are seasoned with a touch of rosemary. I think you will enjoy them." Victoria reached out to take the bowl. For a brief, shining moment, the grand illusion of the loving, reformed matriarch held steady. But as her pale, wrinkled fingers brushed against the dark skin of Naomi's hand, the mask slipped. It was microscopic. It lasted less than half a second, but I saw it with absolute crystalline clarity. As their skin made contact, Victoria's hand violently recoiled. It was an involuntary, visceral flinch, a deeply ingrained physical reaction of pure, unadulterated disgust. The muscles around her eyes tightened, and her upper lip curled upward in a tiny, almost imperceptible sneer. It was the exact same look of revulsion she had worn on her face 11 years ago, when she pointed at the door and demanded I leave. The biological response was so deeply wired into her nervous system that not even the desperate need for $4 million could completely suppress it. She recovered almost instantly. The sneer vanished, replaced by that same sugary, manufactured smile. She gripped the porcelain bowl firmly, bringing it toward her plate. "Oh, thank you so much, dear," Victoria said, her voice perfectly steady. "They smell absolutely divine." She carried on talking, completely unaware that she had just exposed the rotten, decaying core of her entire existence. Edward did not notice it. Naomi, already pulling her hand back to adjust her napkin, did not seem to catch the full severity of the flinch. But I saw it. I saw the truth hiding beneath the expensive wool coat and the tearful apologies. I sat perfectly still, chewing a piece of roasted vegetable, while my mind processed the overwhelming magnitude of what that single fleeting movement meant. The racism was not dead. The hatred, the profound sense of aristocratic superiority, the deep-seated prejudice that had shattered our family a decade ago, was still entirely intact. It had not been cured by time, and it had not been softened by the global pandemic. It had simply been temporarily suspended, locked away in a dark mental closet because they needed my money. They were willing to swallow their pride, sit at my table, and eat food prepared by a black woman, all while internally suffocating on their own bigotry. They were putting on a grand theatrical production of family healing, entirely funded by their own desperate greed. They viewed Naomi not as a human being, not as my brilliant, accomplished wife, but as a temporary, unpleasant obstacle they had to navigate in order to reach the vault. A cold, absolute calm settled over my entire body. Any lingering trace of familial guilt, any small, naive hope that my mother and brother had actually changed, evaporated into thin air. I was not looking at family anymore. I was looking at two highly dangerous predators who had invaded my sanctuary. They thought they were playing me, but that microscopic flinch had given me the ultimate advantage. It confirmed everything I needed to know. The battle lines were clearly drawn, and I was going to ensure that their punishment was absolute. With Victoria's true nature laid bare before me, I shifted my focus entirely to my younger brother. Edward was sitting to her left, completely oblivious to the silent revelation that had just occurred. He was too consumed by his own internal nightmare to notice his mother's momentary lapse in performance. I took a slow sip of my water, letting the cool liquid soothe my throat, while I studied him with the clinical precision of a surgeon examining a complex fracture. If Victoria was a masterclass in calculated manipulation, Edward was a walking, breathing monument to sheer panic. He was trying desperately to project the image of a seasoned financial executive navigating a temporary cash flow issue, but the physical reality of his body was betraying him in real time, broadcasting a completely different story to anyone trained to read the signs. I have spent 4 decades sitting across the table from some of the most powerful and ruthless businessmen in the country. I have negotiated buyouts, navigated hostile takeovers, and watched men lose millions of dollars in the blink of an eye. I know exactly what standard financial ruin looks like. When a legitimate businessman is facing a conventional bank foreclosure, the emotional response is usually one of profound depression, deep resignation, or a quiet, heavy shame. They move slowly. They look defeated. They speak in hushed, tired tones about restructuring and bankruptcy courts. Edward did not look defeated. Edward looked like a man who was actively being hunted. The physical symptoms were impossible to ignore. Despite the comfortably cool temperature in our climate-controlled dining room, a distinct sheen of perspiration coated Edward's forehead. He kept reaching up to dab at his brow with his linen napkin, trying to pass it off as a casual gesture. But the moisture kept returning, soaking into the collar of his expensive, custom-tailored shirt. Beneath the heavy mahogany table, I could actually feel a faint, rhythmic vibration transmitting through the solid wood. It was his right leg. He was bouncing his knee up and down with the frantic, uncontrollable energy of a cornered animal. The rapid tapping was so intense, it was making the silverware on his side of the table rattle very softly against the porcelain plates. But the most glaring piece of evidence was his smartphone. A man facing a strict deadline from a traditional commercial bank does not need to check his phone every 60 seconds during a critical family dinner. Traditional bankers work standard hours. They send formal, heavily worded letters via certified mail. They route their communications through designated legal counsel. They do not send rapid-fire, late-night text messages. Yet Edward could not leave his device alone. He had placed it face down next to his water glass, but his fingers constantly hovered over it, twitching with a desperate, pathetic anxiety. Every time the screen illuminated with a silent notification, he would quickly snatch the phone off the table, holding it close to his chest to shield the display from our view. I watched him unlock the device multiple times. I have excellent vision for my age, and I could clearly see the dark interface of the application he was using. It was not a standard email client or a traditional text messaging service. The screen was black with bright green text, the unmistakable interface of a highly secure encrypted messaging platform designed to leave absolutely no digital footprint. Legitimate financial institutions do not use disappearing, encrypted messages to collect overdue mortgage payments. They want a paper trail. They demand documented proof of correspondence. The people Edward was communicating with clearly wanted the exact opposite. They wanted to remain entirely invisible in the shadows. My analytical mind immediately began piecing together the fragmented puzzle. $4 million is a substantial amount of money, but it is not an insurmountable sum for a high-level investment fund manager with decent credit and a portfolio of collateral. If Edward had simply made a few poor investments during a market downturn, he could have easily filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. He could have reorganized his debts, taken a temporary hit to his credit score, and eventually bounced back. The legal system is designed to protect wealthy men from total destruction. But you do not file for bankruptcy when you owe money to the kind of people who use encrypted applications. You cannot negotiate a restructuring plan with predators. The terror radiating from my brother, it was not the fear of losing a piece of real estate. It was not the fear of a ruined reputation or a damaged financial portfolio. It was something far more primitive and deeply visceral. It was the raw, unadulterated fear for his own physical safety. He was sweating because the men on the other end of those encrypted messages were not threatening his credit rating. They were threatening his life. They were threatening to break his legs to find him in the dark, to extract their $4 million in blood if he failed to produce the cash. This realization fundamentally shifted my understanding of their sudden visit. They had not come here to save the ancestral Caldwell estate out of some noble, misguided sense of family tradition. The estate was merely a convenient emotional prop. They were using my nostalgic attachment to our family history as a psychological weapon to extract a massive ransom. Victoria was likely fully aware of the danger Edward was in. Her tears were a calculated performance designed to protect her golden child from the violent consequences of his own spectacular failures. They were entirely willing to drain my hard-earned wealth to pay off an underground syndicate, and they had the sheer audacity to package this extortion as an olive branch of family healing. I took another bite of my meal, forcing myself to chew slowly and deliberately. The urge to confront them immediately, to demand the truth, and expose their pathetic charade was incredibly strong. But I knew that acting on emotion was the fastest way to lose control of the board. If I accused Edward of dealing with dangerous criminals without hard, verifiable proof, he would simply deny it. Victoria would immediately rush to his defense, accusing me of being paranoid and cruel. They would pack up their things, leave my house, and find some other desperate method to secure the funds. I needed them to believe that their incredibly flawed strategy was actually working. I needed them to feel secure in their deception, so they would let their guard down entirely. I looked back across the wide mahogany dining table at my younger brother. He was nervously wiping yet another heavy drop of cold sweat from his damp brow as his dark phone silently illuminated once more. I felt a profound sense of absolute clarity wash over me. I was not dealing with greedy relatives anymore. I was dealing with cornered criminals. They truly believed they were manipulating a foolish old man who was blinded by a pathetic desire for their affection. They had absolutely no idea that they had just handed me the very rope I would use to hang them. I smiled warmly at Edward, providing a perfect mirror for his own twisted deception. I raised my water glass, offering a small toast to the empty air, and silently prepared my next strategic move. The real game was finally about to begin, and I was going to utterly and completely destroy them. I watched the realization hit my brother. He realized I was not a senile old man begging for a place at the family table. I was a man who had built an empire by calculating risks and demanding verification. Edward shifted nervously, pulling at the crisp collar of his shirt. He let out a harsh, tight laugh, waving his hand dismissively through the air. "Oh, come now, Richard. There is absolutely no need to involve the banks or complicate things with unnecessary corporate bureaucracy. This is a family matter. We should handle it internally, just between us." He reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a single neatly folded document, sliding it across the polished mahogany table toward me. "Here. I had my attorney draft a simple family trust transfer. It is completely legal and binding. You just wire the $4 million directly to this specific trust account, and I will handle the creditors personally. It is so much faster this way, and it keeps the bank out of our private family business. We can resolve this entire ugly mess by tomorrow morning." I did not immediately reach for the document. I looked down at the single sheet of paper resting on the table, and the internal alarm bells that had been ringing faintly in the back of my mind suddenly deafened me. The chief executive officer inside me recognized the danger instantly. A legitimate financial institution facing an imminent foreclosure does not accept a multi-million-dollar payment through an intermediary family trust transfer designed by a private attorney. They demand direct, verifiable wire transfers specifically referencing the original loan origination numbers. They demand a rigid, heavily documented chain of custody. The document sitting in front of me was not a solution to a real estate crisis. It was a generic, deeply flawed instrument designed to quickly and quietly move a massive sum of untraceable liquid cash. Edward was trying to bypass every single standard financial safeguard. He was trying to prevent my accountants from independently verifying the existence of the supposed bank debt. I finally reached out and picked up the paper, holding it by the very edge. I scanned the text quickly. The language was incredibly vague. It designated the receiving account not to a recognized commercial lending institution, but to a newly formed limited liability company registered in Delaware. It was a shell company. A black hole designed to swallow the $4 million whole, ensuring the money could never be tracked or recovered once the wire cleared. This is a fraud. The realization struck me with absolute horrifying certainty. The entire story about the ancestral estate facing a standard bank foreclosure was a complete fabrication. Edward had not lost money in the commercial real estate market due to the pandemic. He had done something infinitely worse. He had engaged in incredibly risky, highly illegal financial maneuvers, and he had lost. He owed $4 million not to a bank with a board of directors, but to an aggressive, unforgiving entity that did not care about family legacies or real estate collateral. They cared only about their money, and they were perfectly willing to use extreme violence to collect it. I placed the fraudulent document gently back onto the table, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the wood. I looked at Edward. His eyes were wide with a desperate, unspoken plea, begging me to just sign the paper and hand over the money without asking any more difficult questions. I looked at Victoria. She was gripping her porcelain teacup so tightly her knuckles were stark white, her jaw clenched in silent, agonizing suspense. They had walked into my home expecting to find an emotionally vulnerable, easily manipulated victim. They had brought a pathetic, transparent lie to a man who spent his entire life identifying and dismantling complex systemic failures. They were completely outmatched. But I knew that if I confronted them now, they would simply deny everything, flee the house, and destroy whatever evidence still existed. I needed to trap them. I needed to build a flawless, legally impenetrable case against my own family, and to do that, I had to play the part they expected me to play. I let out a long, shuddering sigh, dropping my shoulders to perfectly mimic the posture of a tired, emotionally overwhelmed old man. I reached up and rubbed my temples, closing my eyes for a moment, as if the sheer weight of this sudden family tragedy was physically breaking me down. When I finally opened my eyes, I looked directly at Edward with an expression of profound, manufactured sorrow. I told him that I desperately wanted to help. I told him that I could not bear the agonizing thought of our ancestral home being auctioned off to complete strangers, and that I was fully prepared to provide the $4 million to secure the family legacy. The relief that washed over their faces was instantaneous and incredibly palpable. Victoria actually let out a small, breathless sob, pressing her pristine white handkerchief to her trembling lips. But then I raised my hand, signaling that there was a minor logistical complication. I looked at Edward, speaking in the careful, measured tone of a man delivering unfortunate but completely unavoidable corporate news. I explained that while I absolutely had the required funds available, I could not execute the wire transfer tomorrow morning. I reminded him that my medical technology company had just completed its initial public offering less than a week ago. I told him that the Securities and Exchange Commissions had placed a strict, non-negotiable 7-day lockup period on all of my personal capital to stabilize the initial market valuation. My liquid assets were completely frozen by federal regulators. I told him I needed exactly 1 week. In 7 days, the federal lockup period would officially expire, the funds would be fully released, and I could wire the $4 million directly into his private family trust account. The blood drained completely from Edward's face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. 7 days to a man dealing with violent underground creditors is an absolute eternity. I watched his frantic mind race behind his eyes, desperately trying to calculate if he could somehow stall the dangerous men holding his debt for another week. His jaw muscles clenched so tightly, I thought his teeth might shatter under the immense pressure. He opened his mouth to argue, to plead for some kind of immediate financial advance or a smaller personal loan to tide him over. But he caught himself just in time. He knew that pushing too hard or demonstrating too much genuine panic would completely shatter the carefully constructed illusion of a standard bank foreclosure. A traditional commercial bank would certainly wait 7 days for a guaranteed $4 million payout. If he acted like he could not wait a single week, he would expose his own pipu as a desperate lie. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply against the stiff collar of his expensive shirt. He forced a rigid, unnatural smile, nodding his head in a jerky, mechanical motion. 7 days, he repeated, his voice sounding incredibly tight and unnaturally strained. Yes, of course, Richard. I completely understand how these things work. Federal financial regulations are incredibly strict. I can easily contact the bank manager in the morning and secure a brief extension based on your firm commitment. A week is perfectly fine. Victoria quickly chimed in, praising my incredible generosity and blessing my massive financial success, completely unaware of the absolute terror radiating from her youngest son. They spent the next 20 minutes suffocating Naomi and me with false gratitude and hollow promises of family unity before finally preparing to leave our home. As I walked them to the front door, Victoria reached out and grabbed my hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong for a woman of 92 years. She looked up at me with those cold, calculating eyes disguised behind a pathetic mask of maternal warmth. "Thank you, my beautiful boy," she whispered softly. "You are saving our family. You are a true Caldwell." I simply nodded gently, pulling my hand away from her icy grasp. I stood on the porch and watched them walk down the long driveway to their waiting luxury sedan. Edward was walking far too fast, already pulling his encrypted smartphone out of his pocket before he even reached the driver's side door. Victoria settled into the passenger seat, not even bothering to look back and wave goodbye. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing them safely out of my sanctuary. I turned around and found Naomi standing in the center of the grand foyer, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked at me with an expression of deep, quiet understanding. She did not ask me if I believed their ridiculous story. She did not ask me if I was actually going to give them $4 million of our hard-earned money. She simply asked me what we were going to do next. I walked over to my wife, taking her warm hands in mine. I told her that my mother and brother had not come to our home seeking spiritual redemption or family healing. They had come to execute a calculated robbery, and they were hiding a desperately dark secret. I told her that I was going to uncover exactly what kind of trouble Edward was in, and that I was going to use it to permanently sever our ties with them. But a predator backed into a dark corner is incredibly unpredictable. If Edward owed dangerous people a massive amount of money, and Victoria was aggressively helping him secure it, I could not guarantee how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted. I could not risk Naomi being anywhere near the inevitable explosive fallout of my impending investigation. I looked into her beautiful, highly intelligent eyes and told her she needed to leave the city immediately. I reminded her of the prestigious global medical conference happening in Boston that she had mentioned wanting to attend several weeks ago. I told her I had already instructed my executive assistant to book her a first-class ticket and reserve the penthouse suite at a secure high-end hotel directly adjacent to the convention center. I framed the sudden departure softly, telling her to consider it an early anniversary gift, a well-deserved chance for her to relax and network with her medical peers, while I handled the highly unpleasant business of cleaning up my toxic family's mess. Naomi is a fiercely independent woman, and under normal circumstances, she would have flatly refused to leave my side during a developing crisis. But she also recognized the cold, unyielding resolve in my voice. She knew that my ability to systematically dismantle Victoria and Edward required my complete undivided focus and absolute strategic clarity. Having to constantly worry about her physical safety would be a massive vulnerability, a dangerous distraction I simply could not afford in the coming war. She squeezed my hands tightly, her dark eyes searching my face for a long, quiet moment before she finally nodded her agreement. She told me to be incredibly careful, to trust my professional instincts, and to show them absolutely no mercy when the time came. Within 3 hours, Naomi's bags were fully packed, and a private black town car was waiting in our driveway to take her directly to the airport terminal. I stood on the front steps, watching the bright red taillights of the car disappear slowly down the quiet, tree-lined street. As they finally vanished, I was completely alone. I drove straight to the towering glass and steel building that housed the law offices of Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan was not just a corporate attorney. He was a ruthless legal strategist who had guided my company through the grueling initial public offering. He was a man who understood how to protect assets, but more importantly, he knew exactly how to dismantle a hostile threat. I walked past his receptionist without an appointment, striding directly into his corner office. Jonathan looked up from his computer, instantly recognizing the severe, unyielding expression on my face. He closed his laptop and gestured toward the leather chair opposite his desk. I sat down and told him exactly what had happened. I detailed the unexpected visit, the fabricated story of the bank foreclosure, and the highly specific request for a $4 million wire transfer to a private family trust. Jonathan listened in absolute silence, taking meticulous notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "They are attempting to defraud you, Richard," he said calmly. "That much is blindingly obvious. A traditional bank foreclosure simply does not operate through third-party family trusts. Edward is trying to completely bypass the standard chain of custody. He wants liquid, untraceable capital." I nodded in agreement. I told Jonathan about the cold sweat, the frantic leg bouncing, and the encrypted messaging application I had seen on Edward's phone. I told him I strongly suspected my brother was deeply indebted to individuals who operated far outside the boundaries of the legal banking system. I needed to know exactly who Edward was dealing with, how much he truly owed, and what kind of leverage they held over him. I needed undeniable, verifiable proof. "We are not going to hire standard private investigators," Jonathan said, reaching for his desk phone. "Standard investigators take pictures of cheating spouses and track down hidden bank accounts. You are dealing with a sophisticated financial executive who is actively covering his tracks. We need to completely dissect his digital and financial life. We need a forensic accounting firm. I am calling a team comprised entirely of former federal agents who specialize in corporate embezzlement and offshore asset tracking. They are incredibly expensive and they operate aggressively." I pulled a checkbook from the inner pocket of my suit jacket. I signed a blank check, tore it precisely along the perforated line, and slid it across the smooth surface of the desk. "I want every single wire transfer, every offshore shell company, and every deleted email Edward has sent in the last 36 months, I told him, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I do not care what it costs. I want him entirely exposed." Jonathan took the check and nodded, a predatory smile forming on his face. "Consider it done, Richard. But a forensic financial audit, even with a top-tier team, will take a minimum of 48 to 72 hours to yield actionable intelligence. Edward is highly motivated and clearly desperate. He will likely try to accelerate his timeline if he feels the pressure from his creditors increasing. You need to maintain your cover. You must keep him absolutely convinced that the $4 million is secure and pending release." I agreed completely. I told Jonathan that I would personally manage Edward and Victoria, keeping them distracted and emotionally engaged, while the forensic team quietly disassembled their entire financial reality. I left the law office feeling a cold, dark energy settling into my bones. I was preparing to destroy the very people who shared my blood, and the most terrifying part was that I felt absolutely no guilt about it. I needed to secure an inside advantage, a way to monitor their private communications when they believed they were completely alone. The forensic accountants would trace the digital money trail, but I needed to capture the raw, unfiltered intent behind their actions. I needed to hear their actual voices. I drove directly to a specialized electronics retailer, located in a discreet industrial park on the edge of the city. I purchased a military-grade voice-activated micro-recorder. It was smaller than a matchbook, capable of recording up to 100 hours of high-definition audio, and designed to adhere permanently to any hard surface. I tested the device in my car, ensuring the audio capture was crystal clear even from several feet away. The technology was flawless. Now I simply needed to plant the Trojan horse deep inside their fortress. The iron gates of the Caldwell estate loomed as I navigated my car down the winding road. In my jacket pocket rested a military-grade voice-activated micro-recorder. I purchased it from a security firm dealing with corporate espionage professionals. It was an astonishing piece of technology coated in a matte black finish. It boasted a highly sensitive omnidirectional microphone capable of picking up whispers across large rooms. Its critical feature was the industrial-strength adhesive backing, formulated to bond instantly to porous surfaces like aged wood. I tested the device meticulously in my secure office, confirming the audio playback was terrifyingly clear. Now I needed to deliver this silent assassin directly into my brother's financial sanctuary. I pulled up to the security intercom and pressed the call button, letting out a slow breath to calm my heart rate. I needed to suppress the calculating executive and resurrect the persona of an emotionally vulnerable older brother yearning for a lost childhood. Victoria's voice crackled through the speaker. I told her I had arrived, injecting hesitant warmth into my tone. The gates swung open immediately. I drove slowly up the manicured gravel driveway. The massive stone facade of the ancestral home rose against the gray morning sky, looking incredibly arrogant and unyielding. Every towering column seemed to project an aura of unearned superiority. I parked my vehicle near the grand entrance and stepped out. Before I reached the top of the wide marble steps, the heavy double doors swung open. Victoria stood in the threshold, leaning on her silver cane, her face stretched into a triumphant smile. She wore a deep burgundy dress, looking far more vibrant than the tragic woman who had wept on my porch 24 hours prior. She truly believed her masterful manipulation had worked flawlessly. She believed she had successfully reeled in her wealthy son, using nothing more than fabricated tears and a hollow promise. Edward stood just over her shoulder, his posture relaxed, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. The frantic energy he had displayed during our dinner was completely gone, replaced by a smug, quiet confidence. They thought they had won. "Oh, Richard." Victoria gasped, stepping forward and wrapping her arms around me in a tight embrace. "I am so incredibly happy you called. I was just telling Edward how much my heart ached for you to walk through these doors again." I returned the embrace awkwardly, patting her back with feigned affection. "I missed this place, Mother." I lied softly, stepping back and looking up at the grand crystal chandelier hanging in the foyer. "I just could not wait to be here. I wanted to feel the history of this house again." Edward stepped forward, clapping a firm hand on my shoulder. "You are always welcome here, Richard. This is your legacy just as much as it is ours. We are a family again, and that is all that matters." I offered him a weak, grateful smile, nodding silently, as if I were too overwhelmed by emotion to speak. Victoria immediately took charge, linking her arm through mine and insisting on giving me a grand tour of the property. For the next 45 minutes, I subjected myself to a grueling psychological endurance test. I played the part of the nostalgic fool. I paused in front of faded oil paintings, tracing my fingers over the ornate frames, while speaking softly about fabricated memories. I walked into my old childhood bedroom, pretending to wipe a stray tear from my eye, as I talked about how much I regretted the lost decades. Victoria hovered close to my side, feeding my artificial nostalgia with her toxic, sugary reinforcement. She validated every false memory I shared, weaving a rewritten history where she had always been a loving mother. Edward trailed behind us occasionally, chiming in with robust laughter and forced camaraderie. Their internal gloating was radiating from them. They were absolutely convinced I was completely under their spell. As we descended the grand staircase, I knew it was time to execute the primary objective. I steered the conversation toward the rich architectural details of the home. "Edward," I said, turning to him with intense interest. "I remember Father spending hours working in his private study at that magnificent mahogany desk he custom-built. Is it still in there?" Edward puffed his chest out proudly, gesturing down the long hallway. "Absolutely, Richard. I use it as my primary workspace now. I have not changed a single thing in that room. It is exactly as Father left it." I smiled warmly, asking if we could spend a few moments in there. Victoria agreed, enthusiastically leading the way. We entered the study, and the heavy scent of old paper, leather, and polish filled my lungs. The room was expansive, lined with towering bookshelves, and dominated by the massive mahogany desk positioned squarely in the center. I walked slowly around the perimeter, running my hand along the polished wood, admiring the space while carefully calculating my physical positioning. I needed Edward out of the room for exactly 30 seconds. I stopped near a small crystal decanter resting on a side table. It was completely empty. I let out a soft sigh, turning to look at my brother. "Edward," I said, my voice rich with sentimental warmth. "Walking through this house has brought back so many powerful memories. I suddenly have a tremendous craving for that vintage bourbon Father used to keep locked in the cellar, the special reserve he opened for monumental family occasions. Could you manage to find a bottle? We should formally toast to our reunification." Edward's eyes lit up. He was thrilled to share a celebratory drink with the man he was actively defrauding. "Brilliant idea, Richard," he said eagerly. "I will be right back." He jogged out of the study, his shoes clicking down the hallway. Victoria moved toward a plush armchair, lowering herself slowly and closing her eyes. I was effectively alone. I moved with immediate precision. I walked casually around the front of the mahogany desk, slipping my hand into my pocket to grasp the micro recorder. I crouched down, pretending to examine an antique brass letter opener. My right hand moved swiftly under the thick overhang of the desktop, finding a deep recess near the center drawer. Using my thumb, I peeled the backing off the adhesive. I pressed the device firmly against the wood, holding it there with absolute pressure for 10 seconds. The adhesive gripped the porous surface instantly. The recorder was now completely invisible, permanently bonded to the desk where Edward conducted his illicit business. I stood back up smoothly, slipping my empty hand into my pocket. I turned toward Victoria, my heart beating steadily with a cold, triumphant rhythm. The trap was armed. 5 minutes later, Edward returned carrying a dusty bottle of bourbon and 3 crystal tumblers. We poured the amber liquid, raising our glasses high. To family, Edward declared, offering a deceitful smile. To family, I echoed softly, looking him dead in the eyes. I drank the bourbon, letting the burn settle in my chest. I stayed for an hour, playing the part of the nostalgic fool perfectly. I exchanged hollow pleasantries before declaring I needed to return to the city. Victoria hugged me at the door, kissing my cheek with false devotion. Edward shook my hand firmly. I walked down the marble steps, climbed into my car, and drove away. I watched them waving in my rearview mirror until the heavy iron gates closed behind me, securing my silent, devastating victory. The 48 hours following my visit to the estate moved with agonizing slowness. I was essentially holding my breath, waiting for the intricate digital puzzle to be fully assembled. I spent those 2 days in my home office, pacing across the hardwood floor, staring out the large window at the manicured lawn. The silence of the house without Naomi was heavy, but it was a necessary sacrifice. I called her every evening, keeping our conversations light and focused entirely on the medical conference in Boston. I listened to her talk about cutting-edge research and keynote speakers, making absolutely sure she remained completely isolated from the toxic storm brewing back home. Meanwhile, my mind constantly ran through various strategic scenarios, calculating exactly how I would leverage the information the forensic accountants were currently unearthing. I knew Edward was hiding a substantial secret, but even I could not have predicted the sheer magnitude of his financial depravity. On the morning of the 3rd day, my secure mobile phone finally vibrated on my desk. It was Jonathan Pierce. His voice was incredibly tight, devoid of his usual polished corporate cadence. He told me to come to his office immediately, stating that the forensic team had finalized their initial comprehensive report. He did not provide any specific details over the phone, which told me everything I needed to know. The findings were volatile. I put on a tailored gray suit, masking my internal anticipation with a calm, professional exterior, and drove directly downtown. When I walked into Jonathan's expansive, glass-walled conference room, the atmosphere was incredibly tense. Jonathan was seated at the head of the long table alongside 2 men in sharp, dark suits. They possessed the quiet, intense demeanor of men who spent their careers hunting white-collar criminals for the federal government. Spread across the polished mahogany table were dozens of thick financial dossiers, printed transaction logs, and complex digital flowcharts. Jonathan gestured for me to sit down, his face a mask of grim severity. Richard Jonathan began folding his hands, resting on top of a massive stack of papers. The narrative your brother presented to you regarding the commercial real estate market and the sudden pandemic downturn was a complete fabrication. The lead forensic accountant, a severe-looking man named Harrison, pushed a detailed summary report across the table toward me. Harrison explained that they had successfully penetrated Edward's heavily encrypted digital footprint. What they found was not a string of unfortunate business investments, but a massive, desperate scheme of systemic embezzlement. For the past 36 months, Edward had been quietly siphoning millions of dollars from the private trust accounts of his most affluent clients. He was not putting this stolen capital into conservative real estate ventures. He was funneling it through a complex web of offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. Ultimately, the money was being aggressively deployed into highly volatile, heavily leveraged cryptocurrency trading platforms. Edward was not a victim of a global economic crisis. He was a degenerate gambler wearing an expensive suit, treating his clients' life savings like chips at a digital casino. I stared at the financial charts, completely sickened by my brother's reckless arrogance. When the cryptocurrency market inevitably crashed, Edward lost absolutely everything. His highly leveraged positions were instantly liquidated, vaporizing millions of stolen dollars in a matter of hours. This catastrophic loss created a massive immediate deficit in his client portfolios. He panicked. To prevent his wealthy clients from discovering the massive theft, he needed to replenish the missing capital immediately. He needed a massive injection of untraceable liquidity to quietly balance the books before the federal authorities noticed the glaring discrepancies. And that is exactly where his terrifying $4 million debt originated. Harrison slid a final stark black folder in front of me. Edward did not owe a standard commercial bank. No legitimate lending institution would ever approve a massive loan based on his severely compromised financial history. Instead, in a state of absolute desperation, Edward had sought out a ruthless predatory private equity firm operating deep within the shadow banking sector. This specific firm was notorious for catering to wealthy, desperate individuals who had exhausted all legal financial avenues. They operated essentially as high society loan sharks. They provided immediate multi-million-dollar cash injections with zero regulatory oversight, but their terms were incredibly brutal and entirely unforgiving. Edward had secured a $4 million mezzanine loan from this predatory firm. The interest rates were astronomical, compounding daily. And the collateral he had used to secure this highly illegal, desperate loan was the deed to our ancestral family estate. He had literally leveraged the historical home of the Caldwell bloodline to bail himself out of a federal wire fraud scheme. The contract stipulated a hard, non-negotiable deadline for total repayment. If Edward failed to deliver the $4 million on time, this shadow firm would not simply take the house through a standard legal foreclosure process. They were known for systematically destroying the lives, reputations, and physical safety of the clients who defaulted on their obligations. The intense sweating, the frantic leg bouncing the encrypted messages during our dinner were entirely justified. Edward was trapped in a financial death spiral, and he was actively trying to use my newfound wealth to buy his way out of federal prison and physical harm. I sat back in the leather chair, absorbing the sheer, breathtaking audacity of his plan. He had walked into my home, looked my beautiful wife in the eyes, and asked for a lifeline to cover his massive criminal enterprise. He had weaponized our family history, using our mother's theatrical tears to blind me to the reality of his profound corruption. The betrayal was so absolute, so fundamentally devoid of any moral compass, that it completely severed whatever microscopic thread of familial loyalty still lingered in my heart. Jonathan sat quietly and watched me process the heavy information. He leaned forward slowly, tapping his expensive pen against the glass table. "We have enough verifiable evidence right here to hand him over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation today," Jonathan stated firmly. "Wire fraud, systemic embezzlement, and grand larceny. Edward would simply not survive a federal indictment. But I knew that simply handing him over to the authorities was not enough. Sending him to prison would punish the crime, but it would not address the deeper, more personal betrayal that Victoria had enthusiastically orchestrated. I needed to understand exactly how deeply my mother was involved in this sickening scheme. I thanked Harrison and his team for their flawless work. I gathered the black folder containing the loan documents and placed it securely in my briefcase. I walked out of the law office with a terrifying clarity of purpose. I had the financial blueprint of their destruction. Now I needed to go back to my office, log into the secure server, and listen to the audio feeds from the micro recorder I had planted in Edward's study. I needed to hear their actual voices, plotting my ruin in the dark. I drove back to my house in complete silence, my mind calculating the precise trajectory of my impending retaliation. The forensic accounting team had successfully handed me the physical evidence required to dismantle my brother's fraudulent life. Now I was going to uncover the emotional malice hiding behind my mother's fake tears. The ultimate confrontation was rapidly approaching, and I would now be absolutely ruthless. I pulled my car into the empty driveway of my home, the silence of the evening wrapping around me like a heavy shroud. Without Naomi there to greet me, the house felt vast and hollow, but the isolation was exactly what I needed. I walked directly into my private study, locking the heavy door behind me. I did not bother to turn on the overhead lights. The only illumination in the room came from the cool blue glow of my computer monitor. I sat down at my desk, my movements slow and deliberate, and pulled out the encrypted access key I had set up earlier that week. I typed in the complex sequence of alphanumeric codes navigating through the secure proxy servers until I reached the private dashboard linked to the micro recorder, currently affixed beneath my brother's mahogany desk. My heart beat with a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I put on a pair of noise-canceling headphones, ensuring that I would catch every single breath, every subtle shift in tone. The interface loaded, displaying a long, continuous audio waveform. I had captured nearly 10 hours of raw audio since planting the device. I began to scrub through the timeline, listening to the ambient silence of the empty study, the occasional chime of a grandfather clock in the distant hallway, and the muffled sounds of the estate staff moving about their daily routines. I fast-forwarded into the late evening hours, watching the flat digital line suddenly spike with erratic, agitated activity. I stopped the playback and clicked the mouse, plunging myself directly into the heart of their private sanctuary. The audio quality was terrifyingly pristine. I could hear the heavy wooden door of the study being shoved open, followed by the frantic, heavy footfalls of a man who was rapidly losing his mind. It was Edward. I listened to him pacing back and forth across the Persian rug, his leather shoes biting into the fabric with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. I heard the sharp, distinct clink of crystal glass, followed by the heavy glug of liquid being poured in a rush. He was drinking heavily, desperately, trying to numb the overwhelming panic that was clearly consuming him. A few moments later, the door creaked open again. The slow, methodical tapping of a silver cane against the hardwood floor announced Victoria's arrival. Her voice cut through the tense atmosphere of the room like a jagged piece of frozen glass. She demanded to know why he was pacing like a caged animal. Edward let out a sound that was half sob, half-exhausted, groan. I turned the volume up slightly, leaning closer to the monitor. He told her that he had just received another message on his secure application. He said the men holding his debt were running out of patience. They did not care about the federal lockup period on my funds. They wanted their money, and they were beginning to describe exactly what they would do to him if the payment was delayed by even a single day. The sheer terror in my brother's voice was absolute. He was a wealthy investment manager who had spent his entire life insulated by privilege, and he was now facing men who operated entirely outside the boundaries of civil society. He told Victoria that these individuals had sent him photographs of his own daily routine, detailing exactly where he bought his morning coffee and exactly what time he drove through specific intersections. They were tracking his every movement. He pleaded with her, asking if they should just confess everything to me immediately, beg for my mercy, and pray that I would authorize an emergency wire transfer to save his life. The silence that followed his desperate plea was chilling. When Victoria finally responded, there was not an ounce of maternal comfort or genuine fear in her tone. There was only a cold, calculated irritation. She sharply scolded him for losing his composure. She told him that he was acting like a pathetic coward and that showing any sign of weakness to me would instantly destroy their carefully constructed narrative. She reminded him that I was a meticulous, analytical man who would immediately sense a trap if they deviated from their original story of a standard bank foreclosure. She ordered him to pour another drink, sit down in his chair, and stop letting his imagination ruin their flawless strategy. The absolute lack of empathy she displayed toward her own terrified son was deeply unsettling. She was treating his mortal peril as nothing more than an inconvenient administrative hurdle. I sat frozen in my dark office, listening to the horrifying dynamic unfold between them. Edward took a shaky breath, the ice rattling loudly in his glass. as he took another desperate swallow. He asked her how she could possibly remain so calm while his life was actively being threatened by violent criminals. He asked her if she truly believed I was foolish enough to simply hand over $4 million without demanding to see the official bank documentation first. Victoria let out a low, humorless laugh that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. She told him that he severely underestimated the blinding power of familial guilt. She said that I was desperately hungry for their approval, and that I would eagerly pay any price to finally be welcomed back into the ancestral home. Then she leaned closer to the microphone, her voice dropping into a sinister, conspiratorial whisper that echoed directly into my headphones. She told him to just keep smiling at your brother. She said he needed to play the part of the grateful, humbled sibling for just a few more days. Once the $4 million hits the account, she stated with absolute chilling certainty, we execute Phase 2. My study, the blue light from the monitor casting long skeletal shadows across the walls. The phrase Phase 2 echoed through my noise-canceling headphones, vibrating against my eardrums with a sickening clarity. On the recording, Edward's heavy breathing filled the brief silence. He sounded genuinely bewildered, as if the sheer malice of his mother's words had momentarily distracted him from his own impending doom. He asked her what she meant, his voice trembling as he pointed out that taking the $4 million was already a massive betrayal. He begged her not to push their luck, suggesting that once the debt was paid, they should simply cut ties and walk away clean. But Victoria was not interested in simply walking away. She struck her cane against the floor again, the sharp crack cutting through Edward's pathetic pleading. She leaned closer to him, her voice dropping into a guttural, hateful snarl that I had never heard her use before. She told him that he was incredibly naive if he thought this was solely about saving his miserable life. She declared with a terrifying, venomous conviction that she would absolutely not let that black woman enjoy a single dime of Caldwell money. The sheer, unadulterated racism in her voice was physically repulsive. It was not the polite, passive-aggressive prejudice she had displayed during dinner. It was a deep, violently rotting hatred that had clearly been festering inside her for the entire 11 years I had been gone. She hated Naomi not just for existing, but for thriving. She hated that I had built an empire with a woman she viewed as inherently inferior. Edward stammered, clearly taken aback by the raw intensity of her bigotry. He asked her exactly what she was planning to do, reminding her that Naomi was a highly respected medical doctor with a flawless public reputation. Victoria let out a low, mocking laugh that made my stomach turn. She told him that public reputations were incredibly fragile, and that they could be completely shattered with a single well-executed lie. She proceeded to outline a plan so meticulously evil that it took my breath away. She calmly explained that she had already reached out to an old, highly unsavory contact from her late husband's past, a local criminal who specialized in discreet, illegal acquisitions. She had paid this man a substantial amount of cash to procure a trafficking-level quantity of illegal narcotics. She detailed how this hired thug had been tracking Naomi's movements for the past 3 days, learning her schedule and identifying the vulnerabilities in the parking garage at her medical research facility. Victoria explained that the criminal possessed the tools to bypass the electronic locks on Naomi's vehicle. The moment the $4 million wire transfer cleared my bank and safely hit Edward's trust account, this man was going to plant the heavy package of narcotics deep inside the trunk of Naomi's car, completely hidden directly beneath the spare tire compartment. The mechanical precision of her plot was horrifying. Edward sounded breathless, asking her what would happen next, pointing out the extreme federal risks involved in handling those types of substances. Victoria shushed him aggressively. She explained that she would not be handling anything directly. She told him that as soon as she received confirmation that the package was securely planted, she had purchased an untraceable prepaid cellular phone to make a single, anonymous call to the Drug Enforcement Administration. She planned to provide them with Naomi's exact license plate number, her daily commuting route, and a highly detailed fabricated tip about a major narcotics distributor operating under the guise of a legitimate medical researcher. Victoria's voice swelled with a dark, triumphant pride as she described the inevitable fallout. She gloated about how the federal agents would intercept Naomi on her way home. She described how they would tear her vehicle apart on the side of the highway, discover the massive quantity of illegal drugs, and place my beautiful, brilliant wife in handcuffs. Victoria laid out the total destruction of Naomi's life with the gleeful enthusiasm of a child opening a gift. She noted that a trafficking charge of that magnitude carried a mandatory minimum sentence. Naomi would be stripped of her medical license instantly. Her life's work in the laboratory would be seized and discredited. Her pristine reputation would be dragged through the mud by the media, and she would spend the rest of her natural life rotting inside a federal prison. On the audio feed, Edward was completely silent for a very long time. When he finally spoke, he did not object to the profound wickedness of destroying an innocent woman's life. He did not defend the sister-in-law who had graciously cooked him dinner just hours prior. He simply asked his mother if she was absolutely certain the anonymous tip could not be traced back to them. His pathetic, self-serving cowardice was absolute and entirely predictable. Victoria assured him that the plan was completely foolproof, completely insulated, and that all he needed to do was keep his mouth shut and wait for the money to arrive. She firmly told him to finish his drink and go straight to sleep, leaving him completely alone in the study. I listened to the sound of her cane tapping away down the hallway, followed by the clinking of Edward pouring himself one final heavy glass of bourbon. The soft, static hiss of the audio recording continued to echo through my noise-canceling headphones. I sat perfectly still in the suffocating darkness of my private study, honestly believing that I had already heard the absolute worst of their sinister plotting. I thought the horrific plan to plant narcotics in my wife's vehicle and send her to federal prison was the very bottom of their moral decay. I was gravely mistaken. The silence on the recording stretched for a few more seconds, punctuated only by the heavy rhythmic clinking of ice against crystal as Edward paced across the hardwood floor. When he finally spoke again, his tone had shifted significantly. The frantic, desperate terror that had consumed him earlier was beginning to recede rapidly, replaced by a cold, calculating greed. "Mother," he said, his voice lowering into a greedy whisper, "the $4 million clears my obligations and gets those violent men off my back. But Richard has at least another $10 million sitting in his personal accounts. Once Naomi is permanently out of the picture, he is just going to be sitting on a massive liquid fortune. What exactly happens to the rest of his money?" Victoria let out a sudden, sharp laugh. It was not a nervous chuckle or a polite scoff. It was a full, genuine laugh of pure, triumphant malice that bounced off the mahogany walls of the study. The sound was so entirely devoid of human warmth, so completely saturated in dark arrogance that it made the blood in my veins run completely cold. "Do you honestly think I have not planned for every single contingency?" she asked him, her voice dripping with an overwhelming sense of aristocratic superiority. "I am absolutely not leaving $10 million in the hands of a man who turned his back on his own mother." She paused, and I could hear the slow, methodical tapping of her silver cane as she moved closer to where Edward was standing. "The moment the federal authorities take that vile woman away in handcuffs, your brother is going to experience a profound, catastrophic emotional collapse. We are going to use his agonizing grief against him." She proceeded to outline the final devastating phase of her master plan with the clinical, unfeeling precision of a military general ordering an execution. She told Edward that she had already established contact with a private, highly unethical psychiatrist she knew through her elite country club circles. This specific doctor had a quiet, notorious reputation among the wealthy elite for providing highly convincing, fabricated medical evaluations for families looking to seamlessly control their difficult or aging relatives. Victoria explained that she was going to use the profound public humiliation of Naomi's sudden arrest as the perfect psychological trigger. She would formally petition the courts, claiming that the immense shock of discovering his beloved wife was secretly a major narcotics trafficker had caused my fragile, elderly mind to simply snap. She would present official medical documents stating that I had suffered a rapid, irreversible onset of acute cognitive decline, rendering me completely and legally incompetent to manage my own massive financial estate. The sheer scale of her legal manipulation was absolutely breathtaking. She detailed how she would use these fabricated psychiatric evaluations to petition a sympathetic judge for an emergency full legal conservatorship over my life and my assets. She would present herself as the deeply concerned, loving mother, stepping in to protect her mentally broken son from his own sudden wealth. And because she was my mother, and because my wife would be sitting in a federal holding cell awaiting trial, there would be absolutely no one left to legally challenge her petition. Edward let out a low whistle of astonishment, clearly impressed by the flawless, terrifying efficiency of her design. He asked her what would happen to me once the court formally granted her total control over my finances. Would I just live out the rest of my days in my large, empty house while they quietly drained my bank accounts? Victoria scoffed at the idea with immediate aggressive disgust. "Let him stay in that beautiful, expensive house," she snarled. "Absolutely not. The moment the ink dries on that conservatorship order, I am selling his entire property and adding the proceeds directly to our family trust." She declared that she was not going to waste a single unnecessary dollar on my comfort or my daily care. She planned to have me forcibly removed from my home and locked away in the cheapest, most obscure state-run nursing facility she could possibly find. She described a bleak, forgotten institution somewhere deep in the rural outskirts of the state, a place where the staff was overworked and the patients were heavily medicated and completely ignored. She said I would spend the remainder of my natural life sitting in a cheap wheelchair, staring at a blank wall, completely stripped of my dignity, my wealth, and my freedom. "I will let him rot there until he takes his final breath," she whispered into the darkness of the study. "That is the ultimate price he will pay for abandoning this family." The recording finally clicked and went completely silent as the voices faded out and the audio file reached its conclusion. I slowly reached up with numb fingers and pulled the heavy headphones away from my ears, letting them drop onto the smooth surface of my desk. The absolute silence of my empty house rushed back in to surround me, but the profound quiet offered absolutely no comfort. I sat frozen in the center of my dark office, staring blindly at the faint, glowing light of the computer monitor. I did not cry. I did not shed a single tear for the mother who had just outlined my total destruction, or for the brother who had eagerly agreed to watch me die in a miserable, forgotten institution. I did not yell. I did not scream or throw things across the room in a fit of explosive, blinding rage. The fiery, passionate anger that usually accompanies a betrayal of this massive magnitude simply did not exist inside me. Instead, I felt a freezing detachment settle deep within my bones. In those quiet, terrifying minutes, sitting alone in the dark, the last remaining shred of empathy I held for my bloodline completely evaporated. The biological connection was severed, cauterized by the overwhelming heat of their unadulterated malice. They were no longer my family. They were dangerous parasites who conspired to murder my wife's freedom and lock me in a living nightmare to steal my money. They viewed my existence as nothing more than a temporary, highly lucrative obstacle that needed to be violently removed. I took a deliberate, deep breath, pulling cool air into my lungs. My mind was no longer racing. It was operating with a terrifying, crystalline clarity. I suddenly knew exactly what I needed to do. I reached across the desk and picked up my secure mobile phone. I dialed the direct number for Jonathan Pierce. He answered immediately on the second ring, his voice sharp. "Jonathan," I said, my voice completely flat and entirely devoid of emotion. "I have the new audio recordings. We are not just stopping a financial fraud anymore. They are currently and actively planning to force me into a fraudulent medical conservatorship. I want you to prepare the final documents for the private equity debt acquisition immediately. It is time to go to war." The exact 7th day arrived with a cold and gray dawn sweeping across the city skyline. I stood near the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows of my corporate boardroom, looking out over the sprawling metropolis below. The room was a monument to modern architectural precision, enclosed entirely by thick panels of frosted glass and polished steel. It was a space designed specifically for intimidation and absolute control. A massive rectangular table constructed from a single slab of tempered black glass dominated the center of the room. I had spent the past week working tirelessly alongside Jonathan Pierce and his team of legal experts, meticulously finalizing the aggressive acquisition of the private equity debt. The trap had been painstakingly constructed, heavily reinforced with federal financial regulations, and completely concealed beneath the illusion of a $4 million wire transfer. Today was the day the heavy steel jaws would finally snap shut. My private executive assistant had officially scheduled the meeting for exactly 10 in the morning. I had instructed her to inform my mother and my brother that we were gathering to physically sign the final authorization documents required to release the locked initial public offering funds directly into their private family trust. At exactly 9:45, the secure elevators at the end of the hall chimed smoothly. Through the frosted glass walls of the boardroom, I watched the blurred silhouettes of Victoria and Edward stepping onto the executive floor. They were early driven by an agonizing cocktail of unadulterated greed and absolute desperation. I remained standing near the window, my hands clasped loosely behind my back, watching them navigate the sleek corporate hallway with an inflated sense of aristocratic entitlement. When the heavy glass doors of the boardroom finally glided open, the visual spectacle they presented was almost sickening. They had dressed for a royal coronation. Victoria was wearing an immaculate tailored black wool suit accented with a single incredibly expensive string of authentic pearls resting against her collarbone. She had clearly spent hours at a high-end salon ensuring her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, her makeup impeccably applied to hide the deep lines of malice etched into her face. She leaned lightly on her polished silver cane not out of actual physical necessity, but as a deliberate theatrical prop designed to command immediate respect. Edward walked closely beside her, projecting the aura of a triumphant conqueror returning home. He was wearing a custom-fitted navy blue suit with a crisp white shirt and a silk tie that screamed of generational wealth. His leather shoes clicked sharply against the polished concrete floor. The frantic, sweating, terrified man I had observed in my dining room 7 days ago was completely gone. He truly believed he had successfully outsmarted his older brother and secured his financial salvation. As they stepped into the center of the expansive room, their eyes greedily scanned the opulent surroundings. They were practically salivating at the tangible display of massive corporate wealth. Victoria turned her attention to me, her face breaking into a sickeningly sweet, entirely fabricated smile. "Richard, my darling boy," she cooed softly, her voice echoing lightly against the glass walls. "I cannot begin to tell you how incredibly proud I am of you. This building, this company, it is simply magnificent. You have built a true empire, and it warms my old heart to see you finally sharing your massive success with your own flesh and blood." She took a slow step forward, opening her arms slightly, as if expecting me to cross the long room and embrace her. I did not move a single muscle. I stood perfectly still, letting my cold, unblinking gaze rest heavily upon her. The warm, maternal illusion she was desperately trying to project shattered against the icy silence of the room. Edward quickly stepped into the awkward void, clearing his throat with a loud, authoritative sound. He pulled a sleek, expensive fountain pen from the inner pocket of his tailored jacket, clicking the cap with a sharp, metallic snap. He was so incredibly eager to get his hands on my money that he could barely contain his physical excitement. "Good morning, Richard," he said, flashing a wide, predatory grin that did not reach his calculating eyes. "We brought the updated routing numbers for the family trust account, just as your assistant requested. The bank manager is standing by on high alert waiting for my personal confirmation call. Once we get these final authorization forms signed, we can permanently put this entire ugly real estate nightmare behind us and move forward together as a united family." He stepped up to the edge of the black glass table, resting his hands confidently on the smooth surface, the golden nib of his fountain pen hovering in the air. I slowly walked over to the head of the long table and took my seat in the high-backed leather executive chair. Normally, when I host important clients or potential investors in this room, my assistant provides a lavish spread of freshly brewed artisan coffee, sparkling water, and delicate pastries. Today, the massive black glass table was completely bare. I did not offer them coffee. I did not offer them water. I did not even offer them a courteous invitation to sit down. I simply looked at them, letting the oppressive silence of the room stretch until it became physically uncomfortable. Edward shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his confident smile wavering slightly at the edges. Victoria lowered her arms, gripping the handle of her silver cane with a sudden rigid tension. The atmosphere in the boardroom was rapidly shifting, the temperature seemingly dropping 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. They were beginning to sense that something was fundamentally wrong, but their blinding greed prevented them from understanding the true nature of their peril. They still believed they were the predators in the room. I reached down to the floor beside my leather chair and picked up a thick, heavy black folder. It contained the meticulously compiled forensic accounting reports, the verified offshore cryptocurrency transaction logs, and the highly illegal private equity mezzanine loan contracts. It was the physical manifestation of Edward's total criminal ruin. I placed the folder carefully onto the smooth surface of the black glass table. I pressed my fingertips against the dark leather cover, holding it completely still for a long, quiet moment. I looked directly into Victoria's eyes, seeing the sudden flicker of genuine uncertainty hiding beneath her arrogant facade. Then, with a single smooth, deliberate motion, I pushed the heavy folder. It slid rapidly across the polished black glass, the sound of the leather scraping against the table echoing sharply in the silent room. The folder stopped precisely in front of Edward, directly beneath his hovering fountain pen. Edward looked down at the dark object resting in front of his hands. He let out a nervous, confused breath, his eyes darting back to meet my gaze. He expected to see the standard wire transfer forms bearing my corporate seal. He expected the easy resolution to his massive self-inflicted nightmare. Victoria took a small step closer to the edge of the glass table, her knuckles turning completely white around the silver handle of her cane. The room was perfectly quiet. The ambient hum of the ventilation system was the only sound vibrating through the tense air. "Open it," I instructed softly, leaning back into my heavy leather chair and folding my hands. Edward hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching out. He still believed he was in total control of the narrative. He grasped the heavy edge of the dark leather cover and flipped it open with a dramatic, highly confident flourish, clearly expecting to find standard bank authorization forms bearing my official corporate signature. Instead, his eyes landed on a stark, brightly colored financial flowchart created by the Federal Forensic Accounting Team. I watched his gaze sweep across the bold heading at the top of the page. The confident, predatory smile vanished from his face so quickly, it was as if it had been violently wiped away by an invisible hand. He blinked rapidly, clearly, struggling to comprehend the highly sensitive, incredibly damning data resting right in front of him. His hand began to tremble uncontrollably. He slowly turned the first page, his fingers stiff and completely uncoordinated. Beneath the executive summary was a thick stack of printed transaction logs, detailing every single illicit wire transfer he had executed through his offshore shell companies located in the Cayman Islands. He saw the names of the wealthy clients he had systematically robbed over the past 36 months. He saw the exact dates, times, and routing numbers he had used to quietly move their stolen capital across international borders to hide his massive financial crimes. He turned another page, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. This section displayed the catastrophic liquidation records from the offshore cryptocurrency trading platforms, highlighting the exact moments when millions of dollars in stolen client funds evaporated into absolute nothingness due to his reckless, highly leveraged gambles. The heavy gold-plated fountain pen slipped from his trembling grip, dropping onto the tempered black glass table with a sharp, echoing clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the silent boardroom. He turned one final page and found a perfect high-resolution copy of the private equity mezzanine loan contract. It prominently featured his signature at the bottom, legally pledging the ancestral Caldwell estate as collateral to an underground syndicate of aggressive shadow lenders. Edward stopped breathing entirely. His chest froze. The healthy, vibrant color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a terrifying, translucent shade of gray. He looked exactly like a man who had just been handed his own meticulously detailed autopsy report. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his absolute exposure. He realized that I knew everything, and that his desperate lie had failed spectacularly. Victoria noticed his sudden, terrifying physical deterioration from across the table. She leaned forward in her chair, gripping the silver handle of her cane tightly, her perfectly powdered brow furrowing in deep, genuine confusion. "Edward," she whispered sharply, her harsh voice echoing slightly in the vast, quiet space. "What is the matter with you? Just sign the transfer papers so we can finish this dreadful business and go home to the estate." Edward could not speak. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish pulled out of the water and left to suffocate on dry land. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, silently begging for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. I did not offer him a single ounce of comfort. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek, minimalist remote control. I rested my hand gently on the smooth surface of the black glass table and pressed a single silver button. Instantly, the high-fidelity audio speakers embedded seamlessly into the ceiling of the corporate boardroom crackled to life. The pristine, unedited audio from the micro-recorder filled the entire room with astonishing clarity. First came the unmistakable sound of ice clinking against a crystal glass, followed immediately by the frantic, heavy pacing of Edward's leather shoes across the hardwood floor of his private study. Then his panicked, desperate voice echoed from above, complaining about the violent men threatening his life. I kept my eyes locked directly on Victoria. I watched her realize exactly what she was hearing. The profound confusion on her face rapidly morphed into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror as her own voice suddenly boomed through the overhead speakers. The recording played her vicious, hateful snarl with perfect acoustics. "I will not let that black woman enjoy a single dime of Caldwell money." The sheer venom in her recorded voice sounded 10 times more malicious when played back in the cold, bright light of my corporate sanctuary. Victoria turned completely ghost white. Her jaw literally dropped open in a silent scream of absolute shock. The refined, aristocratic mask she had worn her entire life shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of me. But the recording did not stop there. The speakers continued to broadcast the meticulous, evil details of her grand master plan. The entire boardroom listened as her recorded voice calmly explained how she had paid a local criminal to bypass the electronic locks on Naomi's vehicle. We all listened as she detailed her intention to plant a trafficking-level amount of illegal narcotics deep inside the trunk of my wife's car. We heard her gleefully describe the anonymous phone call she planned to make to the Drug Enforcement Administration the very moment the $4 million wire transfer cleared the bank. We heard her gloat about how Naomi would lose her medical license, have her pristine reputation dragged through the mud, and spend the rest of her natural life rotting inside a federal prison simply because of the color of her skin. Victoria raised her trembling hands to cover her mouth, her eyes wide with a profound, suffocating panic. She tried to look away from me, but she was completely trapped by the overwhelming weight of her own recorded malice. She was drowning in the undeniable auditory proof of her severe, calculated wickedness. The audio playback mercilessly moved into the final, devastating phase of their conspiracy. The room echoed with Edward asking what would happen to my remaining $10 million once Naomi was locked away. And then came Victoria's cold, triumphant laughter. The speakers broadcast her horrific plan to bribe a corrupt private psychiatrist and use the public humiliation of Naomi's arrest to declare me mentally incompetent due to acute cognitive decline. We all heard her state her intention to seize full legal conservatorship over my life, drain my massive financial accounts into the family trust, and forcibly lock me away in a cheap state-run nursing home until I took my final breath. The recording finally clicked off, leaving the boardroom, drowning in a thick, deafening silence. Victoria looked as though she was going to be physically sick. She slumped back into her leather chair, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull oxygen into her failing lungs. Her silver cane slipped from her trembling grasp, crashing onto the concrete floor with a loud metallic ring that made her flinch. Edward began to actively hyperventilate, clutching his chest with both hands as his panic attack reached a terrifying, uncontrollable crescendo. He was gasping for air, fully realizing that his entire existence was over. "Richard," he finally stammered, his voice cracking violently as he stared in sheer terror at the black folder and the remote control resting on the glass table. "This is completely and utterly illegal. You absolutely cannot do this to us. We are your own flesh and blood, and you must stop this absolute madness right now." I looked down at him, my expression unchanged by his pathetic outburst. I stood up from my high-backed leather chair, taking a slow moment to adjust the cuffs of my tailored suit. The movement commanded the silent room, drawing their terrified eyes toward me. I rested my fingertips lightly on the edge of the black glass table. "You are entirely mistaken, Edward," I said, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. "There is absolutely nothing illegal about what is happening here today. Every action I have taken over the past week has been meticulously executed within the strict boundaries of corporate and federal law." I shifted my gaze to my mother. "You sat at my dining table," I continued, "and you told me that you desperately wanted to save the family estate. You begged me to rescue our historical legacy from aggressive strangers. I gave you my word that I would handle the situation, but you do not own the estate anymore." Victoria let out a short gasp, her pale hands fluttering up to grasp her pearl necklace. "That is impossible," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The deed is still in the family trust. We just need the $4 million to satisfy the bank." I picked up the black leather folder and slowly flipped it closed. "You never owed a traditional bank, Mother," I stated clearly, shattering her final illusion. "Edward took out a highly illegal mezzanine loan from a ruthless private equity syndicate to cover his massive federal embezzlement losses. As soon as I discovered the true nature of his debt, I instructed my attorney to contact those dangerous men directly. I used $4 million of my own liquid cash to legally purchase the debt of Edward outright from the Shadow Syndicate. The transfer of the promissory note was officially finalized at exactly 8 this morning. I am now your sole creditor. I own the debt in its entirety." Edward let out a strangled cry, burying his face in his trembling hands, as the devastating reality completely destroyed him. He knew exactly what the terms of that predatory contract stipulated. "And because you failed to deliver the required payment within the strict time frame dictated by the original contract, I continued, keeping my voice utterly devoid of mercy. You are now officially in a state of terminal default. I am legally executing the foreclosure on the collateral exactly as the contract allows. The ancestral home no longer belongs to the Caldwell family trust. It belongs entirely to me." Victoria began to visibly shake, her entire body quivering. "But you cannot do this," she pleaded, her voice rising into a sharp wail. "That house is our history. It is where you were born. It is my home. You cannot throw your own mother out into the street." I stepped around the edge of the black glass table, walking slowly, until I stood just a few feet away from her shrinking figure. "You have exactly 24 hours to pack whatever personal belongings you can carry and vacate my property," I told her, my tone dropping to a quiet, lethal whisper. "Because yesterday afternoon, the very moment the deed was legally transferred into my possession, I signed a secondary authorization document. I gifted the entire estate. I legally transferred the deed, free and clear of all encumbrances, entirely into the name of Naomi." I leaned in slightly. "The brilliant black woman you viciously tried to destroy, the woman you plotted to send to federal prison out of pure racist hatred, now owns the very house you were born in. She owns the grand staircase. She owns the library. and she does not want you living in her house. The physical impact of those words was absolutely devastating. Victoria let out a sudden gasp, clutching her chest with both hands. Her eyes rolled back slightly, and she collapsed heavily against the back of her leather chair in sheer, unadulterated shock. The realization that she had been utterly defeated by the very woman she considered inferior completely broke her aristocratic spirit. She struggled to pull oxygen into her lungs, her mouth opening and closing silently as the total destruction of her beloved legacy finally crushed her arrogant soul. She had gambled her entire existence on bigotry and greed, and she had lost absolutely everything. Before Edward could process the sudden collapse of his mother, the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open with a loud crash. Jonathan Pierce walked into the room, his face a grim professional mask. Directly behind my attorney were four stern individuals wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed boldly across their backs. The lead agent stepped forward, his eyes locking onto my brother, Edward Caldwell. The agent announced, his voice carrying the heavy authority of the federal government. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of systemic wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate embezzlement." Edward let out a pathetic whimper. His legs completely gave out beneath him. He dropped to his knees on the polished concrete floor, holding his hands out toward me in a gesture of absolute desperation. "Richard, please," he sobbed, tears pouring down his gray face. "You have to stop them. You have all the money. You can fix this. You can pay them off. We are brothers. I am your blood. Do not let them take me away. Please, Richard, I am begging you." He crawled forward on his knees, reaching out to grab my trousers. I took a slow step back, ensuring his grasping hands met empty air. I looked down at the weeping, broken man. The memory of him standing silently in the foyer 11 years ago, watching my mother banish me from the family, flashed vividly through my mind. I looked at him with ice in my veins, feeling absolutely no remorse. "Mother always taught me that a man must clean up the trash in his own house," I said softly. "I am just following her advice." The lead agent stepped forward, grasping Edward firmly by the shoulder and hauling him to his feet. He pulled the hands of my brother behind his back, and the click of steel handcuffs echoed loudly. Edward continued to sob uncontrollably as the agents read him his Miranda rights. They marched him out of the room. The glass doors swung shut behind them, sealing his dark fate. I stood alone with Victoria, the absolute, crushing silence returning to the massive corporate boardroom as her arrogant world burned completely to ashes around her. The silence in the massive corporate boardroom was absolute. Victoria remained slumped in her leather chair, her chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. She looked like a fragile, hollow shell of the domineering matriarch who had terrorized me for decades. I did not offer her a glass of water. I did not call for medical assistance, knowing her physical distress was simply the manifestation of her shattered ego. After a few agonizing minutes, she slowly raised her head. The venom was gone, replaced by a pathetic, desperate realization of her new reality. "Richard," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper, completely stripped of all its former aristocratic polish. "Where will I go? I have no one else. Your father's friends. They will cast me out the moment this becomes public." I looked down at her, feeling a profound sense of closure. "That sounds like a logistical problem for a woman who is no longer my concern," I replied, my voice echoing coldly off the frosted glass walls. I pressed a button on my desk phone, instructing my security detail to escort the former Mrs. Caldwell out of the building. 2 burly guards in sharp suits entered immediately. They did not touch her, but their imposing presence was enough. Victoria slowly gathered her silver cane, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the handle. She walked out of the boardroom, her head bowed in absolute defeat, taking the long, humiliating walk past my employees who watched the fallen queen exit her son's empire in total disgrace. With the toxic remnants of my past finally excised from my life, I immediately ordered my private pilot to prep the company jet. I flew through the night to Boston, where Naomi was attending her global medical conference. The heavy burden I had carried for 11 years was completely lifted from my shoulders. When I arrived at the luxury penthouse suite adjacent to the convention center that I had booked for her, it was just past midnight. She opened the door wearing a plush white robe, her beautiful face lighting up with relief when she saw me standing in the hallway, completely unharmed. I stepped inside, wrapped my arms around her, and held her tightly. We sat on the balcony overlooking the glittering Boston skyline, and I recounted every single detail of the past week. I told her about the forensic accountants, the horrifying audio recordings outlining Victoria's plan to plant narcotics in her car and send her to federal prison, and the ultimate trap I had sprung in the boardroom. She listened in absolute silence, her intelligent eyes processing the sheer magnitude of their wickedness. When I handed her the thick, notarized manila envelope containing the deed to the Caldwell ancestral estate, legally transferred solely into her name, a profound emotion washed over her features. I told her the ancestral home was hers to do with as she pleased. She could sell it, demolish it, or leave it entirely empty as a monument to our victory. She traced her fingers over the official seal, a slow, brilliant smile forming on her lips. "I don't want to live there, Richard," she said softly, looking out at the city lights. "But I know exactly what we are going to do with it." Back in the city, the strict 24-hour deadline I had given Victoria to vacate the property expired with ruthless precision. I had hired a private security firm and a high-end moving company to oversee her departure, explicitly instructing them not to allow her to take anything that belonged to the estate's historical inventory. She was permitted only her clothing, her jewelry, and her personal effects. My security supervisor later provided me with a detailed report of her final hours in the house. She had wandered through the massive echoing halls like a ghost, sobbing uncontrollably as movers packed her tailored wool coats into standard cardboard boxes. When the time came to hand over the heavy brass keys, she refused to look the security team in the eye. With her bank accounts heavily monitored by the federal investigation into Edward's embezzlement and her elite social circle rapidly abandoning her to avoid the impending scandal, Victoria had no choice but to rent a small, cramped apartment in a dreary, working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. There were no vaulted ceilings, no imported marble floors, and no staff to manipulate. She was left entirely alone with her bigotry and her monumental regrets, living out the rest of her days in the exact kind of obscure state. Run misery she had once plotted to force upon me. Edward's downfall was even more spectacular, playing out aggressively across the national financial news networks. The federal prosecutors from the Federal Bureau of Investigation were absolutely merciless. The evidence provided by my forensic accounting team, detailing his massive offshore cryptocurrency losses and systemic embezzlement, was so overwhelmingly comprehensive that his high-priced defense attorneys advised him to plead guilty immediately to avoid a lengthy, highly publicized trial. During his sentencing hearing, he stood before a federal judge looking completely broken, his expensive custom-tailored suits replaced by a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The judge cited his profound lack of remorse and the calculated nature of his crimes, handing down a 25-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The predatory shadow syndicate he owed the $4 million to was simultaneously dismantled by a joint task force utilizing the digital footprint and encrypted messaging logs we had uncovered. Edward was locked away behind thick concrete walls and reinforced steel bars permanently removed from society. He traded the luxurious mahogany study of the Caldwell estate for an 8-by-10-foot concrete cell. As for the Caldwell estate itself, Naomi's vision for the property was nothing short of poetic brilliance. We poured $5 million from our newly acquired wealth into a massive renovation project, completely gutting the oppressive dark interiors of the house. We tore down the heavy velvet curtains, stripped away the dark wood paneling, and knocked down the walls of my father's old mahogany study. We flooded the space with natural light, installing massive glass partitions and state-of-the-art laboratory equipment. Within a year, the ancestral home that had once banished my wife purely for the color of her skin was officially reborn as the Caldwell Naomi Institute for Medical Innovation. We transformed the sprawling grounds into a fully funded research sanctuary, specifically dedicated to providing grants, advanced laboratory access, and full-ride medical scholarships for brilliant underprivileged minority women in STEM fields. The grand dining room where my mother had once sneered at my wife was now a vibrant collaborative cafeteria where young, gifted scientists gathered to discuss cutting-edge genetic research. The library where my father once hoarded his wealth was converted into a massive digital archive and study hall. On the day of the grand opening, Naomi stood on the very same marble steps where Victoria had once banished me into the freezing rain. She cut a bright red ribbon surrounded by dozens of talented young women who were finally getting the opportunity they deserved. I watched my brilliant medical researcher wife smile, her grace and intelligence illuminating the space, effectively cleansing the property of its dark, toxic history. By destroying a legacy of hatred, we had successfully planted the seeds for a legacy of healing. The Caldwell name no longer stood for aristocratic arrogance or deeply ingrained prejudice. Because of Naomi, it now stood for progress, inclusion, and the relentless pursuit of a better future. And as I held her hand in the warm sunlight, listening to the joyful chatter of the new students filling the halls, I knew with absolute certainty that true wealth is never measured by the size of your estate, but by the undeniable impact of the legacy you choose to leave behind. Blood does not make a family. Respect, loyalty, and love do. We often blind ourselves to the toxic nature of our relatives because society tells us that family is unconditional. But when people show you they view you only as a resource, believe them the first time. Integrity means protecting the people who actually stood by you in the dark, even if it means permanently severing ties with those who share your DNA. Setting a ruthless boundary is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-respect and survival. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace or your spouse? How did you find the strength to do it? Let me know your story in the comments below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more real-life lessons. Stay strong and remember to always protect your inner peace.